Path of Exile is on an absolute roll lately, with the Settlers of Kalgor expansion reaching peak player count and the PoE 2 on the horizon. The excitement brought me back to the game. I initially played this game since closed beta over 10 years ago, but eventually stopped around the Fall of Riot expansion. But boy, have I missed out. I got the voice tones on the main league mode, and although it was a blast, I missed the slower paced gameplay that was so defining of PoE in its early days. Every single rare item that dropped made your heart skip a beat as you frantically opened the inventory to identify it. Since PoE 2 is so close to release and is promising something closer to that experience, I decided as a warm-up to take on the next best thing, Path of Exile's hardest game mode, Ruthless. This version of the game takes scarcity to the extreme. While in the normal game you drop plenty of items and are expected to finish the campaign with at least a 5 linked skill, in Ruthless it is absolutely normal to have blue items equipped and a 2 linked skill when you defeat Kitava. This is the first time I play this mode, and my goal is to finish the campaign with at most 3 deaths. Will I be able to beat this challenge and consider myself prepared for the release of PoE 2? Let's find out. First things first, we have to choose the character we are going to play. Since good items are so scarce, we'll have to rely on the passive tree to give us the needed life and resistances. So we're playing the Marauder. Playing a melee based class comes with its downsides though, since your damage is dependent on what weapon you can find, so you'll see us struggling a lot to upgrade our weapon as often as we can with the limited resources at our disposal. We wake up alone on the beach, and after defeating the first enemy we encounter, we pick up the skill gem, Heavy Strike. We're going to be using this for a few levels until we can get something better. We then move on forward to take on the first unique boss of the game, Hillock, which has been nicely awaiting us on the beach ever since we woke up. Upon defeating him, he drops the skill gem Quickstep, which is arguably one of the most important skills in Ruthless. You see, Quickstep is a movement ability, and unlike the normal game mode of Path of Exile, other movement abilities do not exist. At least not the unconditional ones like Leap Slam, Shield Charge or Flame Dash. It does feel like this ability is the equivalent of the dodge roll they're trying to introduce in Path of Exile 2, and it makes boss fights much more interesting than being able to just zoom around the arena and dodge everything. Defeating Hillock also got our first level up, so we spend the first skill point we have getting some extra armor and life. Then we move on to Lionized Watch, where we can pick up the Molten Strike skill that we are going to be using for the first few levels until we get something better. Soon after, we find our first Crimson Iron Vein. This is some resource that we are going to be using to develop our King's March town, which is this league's mechanic. The league mechanic is going to be very important for our progression, but we'll dive into it deeper once we get to it. In Ruthless, every piece of item is important, and we make sure to pick up any blue items, since if we identify them and then sell them to the vendor, we are likely to be getting some transmutation shards. This currency will allow us to transform normal white items into more powerful blue items that can have 1 or 2 mods that can be very helpful for us, like extra damage or extra resistances to elements. Excitingly, we even managed to find our first rare item. Rare items can have up to 6 modifiers on them. However, in Ruthless, even this aspect is nerfed, since items are more likely to have less than 6 modifiers compared to the normal leagues. This armor gives us a bit of extra life and a bit of extra cold resistance. Not bad compared to the white item that was giving us basically nothing. Throughout our adventure, we're going to be keeping an eye out for these specific mods. Extra maximum life and any elemental resistance. We're going to be stacking these as much as we can, since we want to reach the elemental resistance cap, which is 75% for each elemental resistance. Moving on, we go to King's March, which is this league's mechanic, which is basically our own town that we can build from the ground up. We go to the docks, which has ships that allow us to send shipments, and based on whatever we send on that shipment, we will be getting items back. Everything ranging from gems, armor, and currency items. This is a very important mechanic, and we will be trying to send as many shipments as we can throughout our playthrough. Continuing our progression to the campaign, we encounter what I would consider to be the first true boss, Brutus. And at this point it becomes really apparent just how bad DPS can get playing Ruthless, when you have a single skill gem with no support gems and with really bad weapons.
Your spirit is the plaything of the ancestors, slave master.
After the Karui ancestors watched us smack Brutus over 1000 times with our Molten Strike, we make our way through the Prisoner's Gate and onwards to the rest of Act 1. As a reward, we pick up Intimidating Cry, which will increase the damage we deal and will be very helpful once we pick up Earthshatter. Then we manage to find a few item upgrades to increase our DPS, and we also get a very good pair of boots that has some movement speed. Movement speed is very hard to come by in this game mode, so we're gonna take any source we can get. We go back to town and we finally pick up the Earthshatter skill, which is the first slam skill that we are going to be using, and is actually going to be the skill we're going to be using all up until endgame. Alongside it, in the passive tree, we are trying to path over to the Warcry Mastery nodes. These nodes will allow us to use the Warcries more often, and generally they will have better effects on our character. The way Earthshatter works is that you slam the ground and you make 5 fissures around you. Then whenever you use a Warcry skill, all of the fissures that were created are detonated for extra damage. We reach Merveil and our character is sufficiently tanky to defeat her without much problems. We pick up all the items she drops, ready to sell them in town, and then the exit to Act 2 opens. We reach the forest encampment and it's time for us to sell everything we've acquired so far. Then we receive the optional quest to defeat the Great White Beast, which is one of the first that we have to do. Many of the optional quests in Path of Exile give you an extra skill point, so they are basically mandatory quests, not optional ones. Our damage is still absolutely garbage tier, so it is our utmost priority to find a better weapon. We pick up a white poleaxe base and we try to use an orb of transmutation on it to make it better. We get a small physical damage roll, which is usable for now. We are then blessed by the RNG gods with a Chaos Orb drop, which is incredibly rare in the Ruthless League. We will be able to use this at some later point to reroll one rare item. Then we move on to take on our first Bandit Lord. After finding our first unique that didn't really help us in any way, we go back to King's Marsh to set up farming. Farming allows us to harvest crops, which when shipped can give you currency items, so this is a very important part of the league to be able to have a constant supply of currency that you can use to craft better items. We then finish our first trial of Ascendancy, which will allow us to pick up the Juggernaut specialty, making us significantly more tanky. At the same time, we drop the Blood Rage gem, which will give us a buff that increases our movement speed and grants us frenzy charges when we kill things. This is gonna help us speed up our clear speed later down in the game. The rest of the act was pretty uneventful, so after a few more item upgrades, we keep grinding our way through it until we reach Val, the Act 2 boss. I would consider Val to be the first dangerous boss in the campaign. His slam attack can deal a lot of damage and can one-shot you even on a tanky build. However, I am very curious if my character is able to tank, so I try to tank one blow with my steel skin up. After successfully surviving the slam, we finish off the fight and then we move on to Act 3. In Act 3 the difficulty is starting to ramp up, so we make it a priority to upgrade our weapon as soon as we can. To be successful in Ruthless, you have to maximize your chances of finding gear. One of the ways we do this is by not specializing into any specific weapon base, so for example we can use both axes and maces up until we reach the endgame. Instead we're specializing in more general things like Warcry usage or AoE damage. This means that as soon as a good axe or mace is found, we can switch to it immediately. The Axe Revender had a pretty decent base for sale. It's still a white item and we tried to improve it with a transmutation orb, however we were not very successful and we got terrible mods. But that's the life in Ruthless and we cannot really afford to buy multiple bases to try crafting it over and over again, and we also don't really want to waste our alteration orbs on it. However, one thing that we can do is use blacksmith whetstones on it, and that increases the damage of the weapon by 20% for just 2 or 3 whetstones. This depends on the level of the weapon, so the earlier you are in the campaign, the less whetstones you have to use. We continue progressing through the act and we reach the first place where you encounter a blight event. So this one is basically scripted to appear here, and it teaches you about how the event functions. Basically, blight is like tower defense in Path of Exile, and you have to place a few towers down to help you against a pretty tough wave of mobs. Usually even with normal DPS you're not really able to clear the mobs during the campaign if you're playing solo self-found, so using the towers here is very important, as basically they have much more damage than we do at this point. And just like everything else in Ruthless, the drops you get from these events are incredibly nerfed, so even here we will not be receiving, we'll probably not be receiving any oils, and if we do receive any currency items we are lucky, but it's still worth it to try it out and see if we can get anything. And we do indeed drop an unique item from this event, but it's not very useful. It's just an Arumvorax rapier. Besides being a base that we cannot really use, it's also just a leveling weapon. It would have been really nice to have this at the start and be on a build that can use it, but for now it's just useless. Back in town, we finish a quest that gives us a few extra skill points, and it's time to take a look at the Warcry masteries that we have been speccing into for the past few levels. So the reason we're speccing into Warcries is because it will boost the damage that we do. Warcries enhance the next slams you do, so for example the Intimidating Cry enhances the next 3 slams instead of 2 because we have a mastery for it. And those 3 slams are going to deal double damage every time we use our shout. Besides that, Earthshatter creates those spikes around it whenever you use it, and using a Warcry on them triggers them and deals the additional damage. Going forward through the campaign, we reach the docks, and a bit of a story time, I guess. If you're new to Path of Exile or have been playing only in the recent years, you might not know that at the time Path of Exile was in open beta, there were actually 4 difficulties. There were 2 acts initially, and you had to go through both of them 4 times. So there was the normal difficulty, there was cruel, merciless, and then the 4th difficulty was ruthless. And I guess that's why they named this mode as an homage to that difficulty that was removed. I think it was removed when Act 3 was added, or maybe when Act 4 was added, I can't quite remember. And then there were only 3 difficulties, so up to normal, cruel, and merciless. And then there was the Fall of Oriath update that added 10 acts, which was incredibly crazy at the time. I remember just how much hype there was when it was revealed that not only are they adding Act 5 and wrapping up the main storyline, but also 5 extra acts that go through each of the first acts in a varied way. So that was groundbreaking at the time, and it's just so much fun. Path of Exile has always been industry leading in this sort of stuff, and I remember fondly all the updates from the early times. And I regret not playing for the past quite a lot of years, but you know, just a lot of other games to play, and I'm glad to be back now. I'm glad to have played this Settlers of Kalgor before they released Path of Exile 2, just to see how the game has evolved. And yeah, at the time I played, there was none of these extra mechanics. The only mechanic you had was strongboxes and rogue exiles and tormented spirits, so that was everything there was. And since then they added blight, they added harbingers, breach, so many things, so many good features. And yeah, Path of Exile has always just been industry leading in terms of mechanics. Nothing comes close to it. Diablo 3 never came close to it, and I am just so glad that they are releasing Path of Exile 2, and it looks incredibly awesome. I'm so excited to play it. So yeah, that was the story time that it all came back from when I went to the docks, because it was a region that was farmed a lot when you reached Merciless. You were farming the docks a lot. It has a lot of has high mob density, so it was a good farming zone. And nowadays there are better ones like the Reliquary, I think, in Act 10, and yeah, things have just evolved since then. Okay, while all that ramble was going on, in the background we have been progressing through the act, and we are already at Piety, after fighting a few tough bosses like Cole and the General that almost killed us. We were at 20% HP there at some point. Now we're fighting Piety, and Piety can be very dangerous, especially due to the fact that we really do not have enough elemental resistances for this fight. Usually I would be with much better gear with capped resistances, but we just have to make do with what we have. And remember, we're not playing hardcore, but our goal is to finish the campaign without dying, so, or well, with less than 3 deaths. But let's see if we can do that. Let's see how that turns out. And we're struggling with Piety, we're struggling with her phase changes, and we are really not doing a lot of damage to her. So this fight is taking quite a long while, and every time we let her energy shield recharge, it just becomes even worse because we have to deal that damage all over again, and she really does not have a lot of time between her energy shield recharging. So we are trying to clear out the portals, and luckily our Earthshatter is helping with doing that, because we are dealing a lot of AoE damage and taking out the portals while we are focusing on Piety.
I will take everything Dominus loves, as he took it from me.
We defeat Piety, and before we move on to the final boss of the act, we have to go through the labyrinth and unlock our first ascendancy points. The labyrinth is quite easy to do, except this godforsaken puzzle that took me way too long to figure out. Whenever you click on one of these switches, the adjacent two ones also switch, and the goal is to get them all in the open state. And yeah, let's just say this took a while. At one point I just began clicking randomly, and that helped us get in a state where we actually was able to solve this very easily.
Stand your ground. I die for the Empire. Before your Emperor, you are worthy. Before the Goddess of Justice, you are worthy. Receive our blessings, embrace our gifts, and rise ascendant. For this is the ending that we all deserve.
As a reward, we get to swap out one of our gems for a random gem of the same color that is a variation on the base skills, and we actually get Molten Strike of the Zenith, which can create a very powerful build. So we pick it up in the case that we get some incredible elemental damage weapons. However, in the end we stick with our Earthquake skill, and we just have this as a backup for the late game. Moving on to the Ascendancies, all of them can create very powerful builds. We were thinking between the Berserker and the Juggernaut, because both of these can work very well with the Earthquake skill. Berserker just increases the damage you do, and in hindsight it's probably the better choice as you're not playing hardcore. However, we go with the Juggernaut, and that will solve a lot of our defensive options. We're just gonna get extra endurance charges, extra effectiveness of endurance charges, more armor, and more chaos resistance. The first nodes we pick up give us Unstoppable, and this effectively prevents us from going below the base action speed or movement speed, and consequently this kinda makes us immune to being frozen, being slowed, temporal chains, and a lot of other ailments. With our newfound strength, we are ready to move on to the final boss of the act, Dominus. The item scarcity of Ruthless is really starting to show through, and we are already struggling with DPS, but throughout Act 4 even more so, and the only upgrade we get is to our shield. So our defenses are pretty covered, and we are not really in the danger of dying, but just progressing through the act is so slow with this build, and that is why I think the better option would have been to ascend as a Berserker for the extra damage. However, we chug along this way through Act 4 and eventually at the beginning of Act 5 our luck changes around a bit and we at least get a rare Karui chopper, which is a good base and has some extra added physical damage on it. And with this upgraded weapon, Act 5 went much smoother than before. And we also in the meantime picked up Fortify, so now every time we hit an enemy with melee attacks, we get stacks of Fortify that reduces all damage against us. This, combined with the armor we have and the endurance charges, makes us incredibly tanky, and our resistances are also capped. Well, at least until we finish Act 5 they will be. So, although there were a couple close calls against Kitava, we managed to defeat him without dying, and the total playtime to finish Act 5 is 12 hours, so we are definitely not beating any speedrun with this. But hey, the death number is at 0, and let's see if we can keep it at 0 in the second half of the campaign as well. Things get even harder from here because Kitava is a jerk and reduces all of our resistances permanently by 30% from now on. Early on in the second part of the campaign, we reach the fight against the Brine King, which is one of my favorite fights during the entire campaign. Honestly, just the visual quality and the animations of this fight come close to the pinnacle bosses, and I think it blows every other campaign boss out of the water. By this point in the campaign, we aren't just killing normal monsters, we are killing literal gods, and Sin is with us the entire journey, and he is ready to absorb the souls of every single god we kill. I am certain there is a plot to this game, but I never understood it. I just remember the plot from when I used to play 10 years ago, where everything you had to worry about was killing Dominus because he was trying to ascend, and that was where the plot ended. By this point in the campaign we have unlocked all the main skills that our build is using, and we are trying to use them as effectively as we can to maximize the damage and our survivability. So on the Q slot we have the Vulnerability Curse, and this just increases the physical damage that we do to enemies, and we try to use it as often as we can against rare enemies or bosses. It also gives a slight chance to bleed, however that doesn't really increase the damage that much, so it's pretty negligible. Then on the W slot we have our guard skill, which is Steel Skin, and it is very effective at keeping us alive. Not only it gives us 1.5 seconds of absorbing up to 1000 damage, give or take, it also cleanses any bleeds we have on us, which is extremely important when we get bled by a powerful enemy, because degen is not reduced by endurance charges or fortify, so it is really dangerous as an ailment. Steel Skin completely negates it and keeps us alive in many cases. Then on the E slot we are using our Quickstep, which is, as mentioned previously, the only movement ability that is available in Ruthless, and it is incredibly important to have when fighting against bosses. Speaking of which, here is Arakali, the end boss of Act 7. This is one of the first bosses that heavily relies on dealing chaos damage, and that is incredibly dangerous because we do not have chaos resistance, it is actually negative. So we take a lot of damage and we come close to encountering our first death. We barely survive, partly thanks to the health regeneration that we have, and also because we are using an amethyst flask, which temporarily increases our chaos resistance. That probably saved us from dying. We move on to the beginning of Act 8 and we can continue with the final parts of our build, which are the shouts that we have on the R and T keys. One of these is the Enduring Cry, and the goal here is to use it just often enough that we do not drop our Enduring Charges, because these reduce all the damage that we take, and without them we are much more squishy. However, we try to not use it too often because we then lose DPS. The goal here is to use Intimidating Cry instead. Whenever we use Intimidating Cry, the next 3 attacks that we have deal double damage, and whenever we use any of these 2 shouts, all the shards that we have on the ground explode, dealing a ton of extra damage. So the goal here is to be as efficient as we can in the rotation between our auto attacks and using our shouts. And our main skill, which is Earthquake, we have already talked about it. Luckily, we have found one support gem for it, which is Ruthless, that doubles the damage it deals every 3 attacks, along with giving it a slight passive boost to the damage dealt. So yeah, as you can tell, we're going to be finishing the campaign with a 2-link skill. This is just how Ruthless is. One additional part of the build that we aren't really using that much is the Summon Flame Golem ability, and we try to use it every now and then because it does give a boost to the damage we deal. However, the problem is that if we do not support that skill gem, the Flame Golem dies pretty easily, so it just takes too long of a while to keep summoning it.
Eclipse of pride, flaming rage, and past the summon you return to the rightful places.
I just have to go out and say that they did a phenomenal job all throughout the second part of the campaign. Acts 6 to 10 all have incredible design on their bosses. So when I played on the normal trade league, I really just skipped through the entire campaign because I just had a ton of DPS and the bosses were dying in just a few seconds, so I never really got to enjoy the mechanics that much. The Uber bosses in the late game are very nice and I did get to enjoy them on the trade league as well. However, I really think I missed out on the campaign and I'm really glad that Ruthless gives you this second experience of the game. I really recommend you to try it out, especially now maybe that the trade league has died off a bit, it's already end league and there's a lot of currency floating around. Playing Ruthless solo self-found is a really good way to prolong the lifespan of this league. All in all, playing the campaign on Ruthless was incredibly fun and I really felt I got to enjoy the game. It's got me very excited for the release of Early Access Path of Exile 2. I'm really curious what they got cooking up there, but from the previews that we've seen so far and all the interviews, man, the game does look very good. I'm excited to see that they seem to be taking a slower paced approach with Path of Exile 2, close to what Ruthless is, but from what we've seen so far, we've only seen the first few acts of the game, so we'll just have to wait and see at the release how the pacing of the game compares by the end. Also, the lack of a movement skill in Path of Exile Ruthless I think was a complete and total game changer because you really do get to experience more of the mechanics of the bosses and you have to think a little bit more about how to mitigate them or outright dodge them. From all the previews that we've seen so far of Path of Exile 2, the dodge rolling is much more prevalent there and you really have to think more about the movements that you make in combat. In that way, I guess it is more similar to a game like Elden Ring, so that is also exciting for me, but I do understand that everyone has their preferences and I do hope that in the end game there is also the capability to have zoom builds and a lot of movement speed, fast clear speed, high-paced gaming. But yeah, all that being said, I'm curious, what do you want to see out of Path of Exile 2? Make sure to leave a comment. Do you want it to be slower paced like it seems to be from the early act previews we've seen so far? Or do you hope that it stays true to what Path of Exile 1 is? During all this talk, in the background we have already finished Act 9 and we are already in Act 10. We are rapidly approaching the end of our journey and boy was it an awesome journey, and so far we haven't died at all, and come on, it's Act 10. The only way we are going to die now is if we die on Kitava. So yeah, everything else is obviously safe and nothing bad is going to happen until we get to the final boss.
Whoa.
Okay, well that's the first death and yeah, that's why we don't play hardcore, because we just got absolutely destroyed. Yeah, so looking back at the video, we died in less than half a second, so it was a bad idea to step behind that door, especially where there was a rare monster just waiting for us and just destroyed us. There were actually multiple hits we took there, but they all came in so quickly that there was just no time to react, and that's what happens when your character has no avoidance like evasion or block chance. But yeah, thankfully we're not on hardcore, and let's see if we can finish the campaign with just one death. While progressing through Act 10, we got this amazing Astral Plate chest piece, which is by far the best item we have gotten during our entire playthrough. Not only is it on a base that gives you 10% all elemental resistances by default, we rolled triple resist on it, all with very good rolls. Everything is 35 resist, so this chest piece by itself gives us 45 all resist, basically fixing all of our elemental resistances. The armor roll is a bit low, however it is decent for Ruthless, it's more than adequate. And it also has no life modifiers on it, which is actually a good thing because there is a life mastery that we picked that gives us 15% increased maximum life. So by far, that is the best item we have got this entire campaign. And with that, we have arrived at the final challenge of our journey, and it is time to fight Kitava. Just before we step into the ring, we use our final skill point to spec into one more endurance charge, bringing the grand total to 7. We have been here once before in Act 5, and there is one simple rule to follow. Dodge the big attacks or just die.
It's over.
So this is it. Finishing the campaign took us 20 hours, as you've seen in that clip, a bit under 20 hours, but I still had to do the final laboratory to get my final ascendancy points, which you can see over here. A bit more elemental damage reduction and physical damage reduction, +1 endurance charge and the unstoppable. This is the final ascendancy tree. And as regards to our passive tree, there's just a lot of health pickups, a lot of Warcry mastery, more life, some fortify, and this axe node is the biggest damage increase we could get on the tree. A few keystones, we have resolute technique, your hits cannot be evaded, and that is actually, oh no, there is also unwavering stance. We cannot evade because we basically have no evasion, but we also cannot be stunned. A bunch of elemental tree that we got on near the starting location of our character. It really helps with the early game of Ruthless to be able to pick up some life, a bit of damage, and all this elemental resistance that is readily available really does help with itemization. Speaking of which, the weapon, the most important part of our build, this is not actually what we had when we finished the campaign, but I did find this upgrade a bit later while doing maps. 150% increased physical damage and is the best I could find. So this is a pretty garbage weapon, honestly. If you're looking at the trade league, this is absolutely terrible, but in solo self-found Ruthless, this is an insane weapon, I would say. We have blue rings, 15% all res, 12% cold and lightning just from the base. Energy shield on the other prefix is just terrible ring. Another incredibly terrible ring. I literally had nothing better than this. Our boots, 30% movement speed, is the only 30% movement speed I have ever found during the playthrough, so I just went with the highest movement speed I could get. We actually dropped this incredibly good unique belt for Ruthless. It gives life, all elemental resistances, and some... reduced flask duration is not good, and the other modifiers don't really matter, but the all res and the life is incredible for Ruthless. Blue gloves, a lot of life, a bit of res, good enough. Helmet, terrible life. A bit of res was good enough. The amulet, yeah, we don't talk about the amulet. And then this is what saved our resistances with 45 all res. It really fixed us up, and we are actually capped on all resistances. We have minus 60 chaos resistance, and yeah, mapping is a pain with this amount of chaos resistance. The flasks are nothing special, just one that removes corrupted blood, one that removes burning, and Quicksilver, as mentioned, is nerfed in Ruthless. It only lasts for 2 seconds, but it's still very good. It's one of the only sources of increased movement speed you can get. So yeah, our Earthshatter has 12,000 tooltip DPS, which was enough to do tier 3 maps decently enough. And we did finish the campaign with only 1 death. However, during mapping we died an additional 4 times in those 5 hours. So we are clearly not scaling enough to be able to do the maps properly, but I'm proud of how far I've gotten in this journey. And as mentioned before, I'm ready to call it here, and I am very, very excited. Ruthless has really hyped me up for Path of Exile 2, and I can't wait to play it. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you then. And thanks for coming along for this journey, and I hope you enjoyed it.